Thanks, Arjan. You're on Team Human, Conscious Intervention in the Machine, coming to you alive from the Impact Festival in Utrecht, Holland. This is where we challenge the operating systems driving our society, reveal the embedded codes, and share strategies for sustainable living, economic justice, and preservation of the quirky nooks and crannies that make people so much more than mere programs. This is where the conscious beats the automatic, an intervention by people on behalf of people. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and I'm on Team Human. Playing for Team Human today, investigative journalist for The Nation and Foreign Affairs, the author of Pandemic, as well as the just released The Next Great Migration, The Beauty and Terror of Life on the Move, Sonia Shah. It's time to intervene on behalf of people. I'm Douglas Rushkoff, and we're all on Team Human. So before we bring out Sonia Shah, I thought I'd share a little bit about the Team Human project, where we're at, and how it overlaps, I think, with Sonia's work. Team Human began as the assertion of human autonomy in a digital age. We're living in a world where billions of dollars are being spent to design software and platforms that control our behavior by technologists whose stated goal is to replace us altogether with AI. Google's original motto, "Don't be evil," may as well be "Don't be human." It's become the underlying ethos of Silicon Valley and the world they're building for us, to separate us from the teeming masses, to build walls. In 2018, when I was speaking to a handful of hedge funders, I learned that the main thing keeping them awake at night was the impending event, be it the environmental collapse or social unrest, a Mr. Robot hack, or even an unstoppable virus that takes everything down. So they hire futurists and climatologists to develop strategies for different scenarios. They purchase property in Vancouver, New Zealand, or Minneapolis, regions predicted to be least affected by rising sea levels, terror strikes, or most frightening of all, mass migrations. Others are investing in vast underground shelters. And I've got a monologue I wrote, which is really, and you can listen to it later on the show, teamhuman.fm in a few weeks. And what I'm looking at there is comparing the plight of the digital billionaires who really want to migrate from humanity altogether. And I was comparing that with really the story of the Israelites and Pharaoh in the Torah, which is a really interesting story because you can look at Torah and Judaism really as the transition of a migratory nomadic people to being a sedentary farming one. The story of Exodus, the weird thing about it is they're nomads with like Jacob and Abraham and all those guys. They just shepherds walking around, walking around. They run out of food and they go down to Egypt. Joseph becomes friends with the Pharaoh and says, "Come on down. We got food here." And they go there and slowly they become enslaved. And they're slaves for 400 years down in Egypt. And even though they're there 400 years, the Pharaoh still considers them immigrants, interestingly enough, and gets the idea in his head that they're going to replicate and then, like bugs, he says, and then turn against them. So they have to escape. Moses, let my people go, and the plagues and all that. And they escape. But the weird thing about it, we all know they got to Canaan or Israel and declared it as their land, but they don't get to Israel in Torah. In those first 5 books, the holy books, they are actually still on the road. When those books end, they see Canaan and they're going to be allowed to go there. But the holiest part is Israelites actually in flux, always in that migrant state of being. And that's what Sonia Shah's book, I think, and her work right now is reclaiming and celebrating for us all in this book, The Next Migration. That when you're always moving and always open, you're always going to be welcoming of the stranger because we will always be strangers ourselves. So it's my pleasure to welcome one of Team Human's true all-star players who has sat through all of these technological issues, Sonia Shah.
Hi,
Hey.
everyone.
Hey, thanks so much for coming on and bearing with us as we deal with the inventions of the technologists. They can't keep us
That's
apart
what
for
we do.
long. I'm wondering, first, your last book, and you wrote it a few years ago, Pandemic, um, which I read the first half of it after this, and I'm wondering, are you experiencing any mu- a little bit of "I told you so" in that?
I mean, it's very frustrating, you know. I mean, I wish there was even a little bit of that feeling of, this is exactly what I said, and you guys should have listened to me. But it's really not like that. It just feels so incredibly frustrating that and it wasn't just me. The reason I could spend 4 years writing a book about how microbes use social and political and environmental forces to turn into pandemics is because people knew how it works. There's all these experts and scientists and case studies and anecdotes and research showing how that process unfolds. And so, that's why science journalists can write a whole book about it, and among other people. So this was all things that we knew was coming. And in fact, really, we've been living through pandemics all along. It's just we generally are able to ghettoize them in marginalized populations so that those of us in the kind of industrialized in the wealthy classes don't really have to think about them. But throughout we've had HIV going on, HIV pandemics. We've had a cholera pandemic going on. We still haven't tamed all the old pandemics of the past: malaria, tuberculosis, cholera. All those things are still
Mm,
going on, despite the availability of cures and like we know exactly how to prevent these things. Still hundreds of thousands of people are getting sick and dying of all those other diseases. So, the fact that it happened here is like we've been just like pulling that, the slot machine handle down again and again and again. These are probabilistic events. And so eventually this was going to happen. But it's still always shocking, right? Like, even if you know something's going to happen, when it actually does,
yeah,
you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I fell through that open door, so,
yeah.
so there's a little bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that with the whole digital thing is for me. Since the early '90s, I've been saying, "Don't let capitalism take this over, or it's going to be bad." And oh well, capitalism didn't want to listen to that. so, so
No.
the pandemic flows so naturally into the Great Migration, because one of the fears of migration, certainly right now with the China virus, um, is that, oh, the Chinese are going to migrate here with their dirty viruses and give it to us. Again, that goes all the way back to biblical times. Oh, look, there's the lepers. They're going to bring this. They're going to bring that. This fear of disease from the other. I guess I'm wondering what, because you started writing this obviously before the pandemic. What was your initial urge really to write the next great migration? I know you're a first generation American, and in some ways you're not at home here or back in India. Was that sort of part of that what motivated it?
That was part of what interested me, but to be, the way I got into this was actually following up on my pandemic research when I had finished that book in 2015, or it came out in 2016. I finished it in 2015, and this was right around the time of the quote unquote migrant crisis in the Mediterranean, when all these people are
Mm,
coming over from Syria and Afghanistan and they're drowning in the Mediterranean, and it's all over headlines, and the borders are all closing in Europe, and all this was happening. And I thought, well, this is, populations are on the move. These are people who are moving from places where vaccine programs have probably broken down. They're, failed states in a lot of ways. People are under a lot of stress. They're moving into places that have a totally different disease environment in terms of immunity and the things, the kinds of pathogens that are around commonly. And so to me, this seemed like a setup for more outbreaks, that this could be, this could kind of aggravate a public health situation. And so I went to Greece to report on the migrant crisis, from that angle, thinking, okay, what are the public health risks going on with this mass movement of people? And what I learned was that every assumption behind that idea was wrong, essentially.
mm,
Like this idea that these migrants are, because they're moving, that they would be introducing new diseases into a place is exactly wrong. In fact, migrants are usually healthier than the host populations they enter, which, if you think about it for 2 seconds, makes sense, because it requires good health and resources and resilience and all of those portable kinds of capital to be able to successfully migrate. Um, but the reason migrants become unhealthy to the extent they do is because they're treated so badly once they get to the places they're going to. So really this whole idea of a migrant crisis was all wrong. It was a crisis of welcome, a crisis of reception, not a crisis of migration per se. And when I started realizing that, I wanted to kind of go back in my own mind of, I'm the product of long distance migrants myself.
Hmm.
I'm not a xenophobe. And yet I kind of reflexively had this negative take on migration, just like everyone else
Hmm.
did, right? Like people are moving around. It's a migrant crisis. We don't even think about, okay, is it good for the people who are moving to move? Is there absorptive capacity in the countries, in the societies they're going to? Is it better for the societies they leave behind? Maybe it contributes to resilience there if they move. These are all things you would want to consider if you were actually trying to decide, okay, is this migratory flow kind of, net benefit or net negative? We don't even do that. We just say, oh, people are going to move because of climate change. People are going to move because of war. People are going to move because of sea level rise. It's a crisis, right? So that's what I wanted to kind of go back and interrogate in this book.
Right, and it's also, I mean, the thing that the book does, I think that the biggest effect of the book is it makes me realize that the sort of thinking of human beings default state as being in situ, that our default state is being stationary. It's really recent. It's like, I always say with people with employment and jobs, like jobs were invented just a couple hundred years ago. We never had jobs before. Employment's modern, and everyone thinks if you don't have a job, it's not worth being alive. It's sort of that way with what country are you from? Where do you live? As if, well, there's us and we're here. And then there's these few other stragglers who then try to migrate. It's like, no, no, no. Migration, talk to any indigenous person, migration is the natural human state. It's the wonder is how we've been able to survive this long by with people not moving, not moving around.
Well, that's true. Or just how we've had this total habit of mind that the norm is to be still and to be rooted and to be sedentary. And I think, in the broad, if you look at a broad sweep of history, you're absolutely right. Movement is the norm. Staying still is the thing that's weird and that really needs explanation. But the whole way we talk about migration is that it's exceptional. It demands explanation. So you don't call, if it's a migrant, we have to know, why are they migrating? Are they an economic migrant? Are they a refugee? Are they asylum seeker? Are they looking for a job? Is it a family? Is it chain migration? All these ways in which we are expressing the fact that migration is the weird thing that we need to explain somehow, because that's the thing that's sort of anomalous and rare, when in fact, every step of the way, as we've learned more and more about our own migratory past, the role of migration in nature, what becomes clear is that migration is central to our experience, and not just us, like a lot of other species. It's how we have survived and adapted on a planet that has been continuously changing.
Right. But you make the point, early on that while animals tend to migrate because of nature, that human beings, at least in modern times, human beings tend to migrate because of weird abstract problems, political things, profitable, profitable or unprofitable things, that it's that our migrations are spawned by political abstractions rather than anything real.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a way in which you could think about wild species is also being affected by those kinds of dynamics. I mean, those are power dynamics within our species, right? Like it's some people in Washington, D.C. saying, well, you can't move across this invisible line I drew right here, but you over there, you can. So those are all kind of power dynamics within our own kind. And I think we just don't know enough about wild species to know that, okay, when the storks are deciding who gets to go on that route to, Sudan, and who gets to go on that other way, maybe it's power dynamics for them too. We don't know. But, certainly for us, we know the way we move around is not shaped by the most convenient way or the most geographically reasonable way to get from A to B. It's all shaped by our politics about our power relations with each other.
But that's gotten reinforced by the kind of naturalism that we were taught in school. Is like there's new world monkeys and old world monkeys. There's the Chinese panda, there's the American fox, and therefore there's also those African people come from there, and the Eskimos come from up there. That as if there's this natural correct place for things, and if they move around, you get an invasive species, and it kills all your plants. So stay where
Yeah,
you're supposed to be.
it's really incredible that we've decided that nation states, which is such a modern thing, right? The whole idea of a nation state is such a modern idea. And then we're ascribing this to wildlife and to like plants and and creatures that have been moving around. And what scientists are recovering now is how much even those species that we think have been there for millennia, well, they've all moved around too. There's this idea of the camel, for example, that the camel, we think of the camel as so kind of rooted to its place that it kind of stands in for that place. The camel, Middle East, yeah, that same thing on the little maps you draw for a
Yeah.
kid. It's like you can draw a camel and that means Middle East, or you can draw a peacock and that means South Asia, or a bear and that is North America. Like it's exactly the same thing, the place and the animal. But in fact, camels are, originally from North America. That's where they originated. They're more common in Australia. They're actually wild in South America. There's this complicated backstory, and all the rootedness that we see, it's a snapshot in time, so it's just right now some of that might be true, or in the last decades of our whatever our kind of perspective is of right now is. But in the broader scheme of things, or it really just depends on what time scale are you looking at. Where are we from? Where am I from? Am I American because my body's on the North American continent, or South Asian because 2 generations ago that's where my people were from, or somewhere in Africa where we all were originally and probably went to a million places in between. It's almost
Yeah.
arbitrary.
It's like, where do you put the starting place? Like they say with technology, that everyone thinks of bad technology as whatever technology came up after their own childhood, right? You have this arbitrary starting moment. Everything else is newfangled crap, right? I like television and transistor radios. And it's like, and damn if anything else is going to interrupt that. But that sense of origin, like, which again we know was mythological. There's no such thing as an Italian. They were, they were Venetians who came from that city. I mean, cities were more like beehives or termite nests or something. They were sort of natural amalgamations of people in localities working together. Then some emperor or king comes and says, "Okay, here's the lines. Everything in this. You're not Venetians. You're not Milanese. You're all Italians." In a nation state, and then people who are born that year think, that's what I am, this is where I'm from, but there was no thing that you were from before, right? So then we fight
Yeah,
over these
it's amazing to
abstractions.
think we used to live quite normally with just fuzzy edges, so we had communities, but they're just like fuzziness in between the communities, just like a gradation of difference that kind of goes on continuously over time, changing a little bit here and changing a little bit there. And we don't now it's such a deeply rooted like paradigm to think about the differences between us as being discontinuous, that there's just like a clean break. This part is America and this part is Canada and this part is Mexico and this part is Europe. That alone is an artificial thing we've come up with, but it's amazing how deeply we've embraced it, and we've incorporated into our all of our ideas about nature, about history, about our place in it, and all of that.
Right, it's them, it's them. And it's like there is no them, there's just lots of us. There's us over there and us over here, but them, and that perspective, particularly in America, of immigrants, Mexican immigrants, South American immigrants, as if it's like a spider in your yoga studio. Oh no, it's contaminated my room. What do I do? Do I get it out? Do I put it in a cage? Do I, because what's it gonna do? But that fear of, and scientists supported this superstition.
Oh
They acted
yeah,
as if this was scientific truth. How dare they? How did they get there? To look at migration as this disaster.
I mean, well, in my book, I trace that historical moment back to Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist in the 18th century, said, okay, I'm going to name everything in the world, all the, plants and all the animals and all the peoples. I'm going to give them a name, and we all can use this one name. And he basically decided, well, wherever I see things are right now, that's where they always have been and will always be. And he came up with that idea not through any kind of interrogation of what was actually going on, but just because he thought nature was an expression of God's perfection. So if he finds this one salamander in this one forest in Sweden, then that must be where God put it, and it must be in a perfect place. And if it's perfect and God put it there, it must have always been there, and it must always will be there. So for him, everything had to be perfect already. So that was his a priori assumption. So it
Mm.
basically he wasn't thinking about migration, but his idea just erased the possibility of migration. Because
Right. He wasn't
everything had to
thinking as you
already be
described.
perfect.
Right. He didn't talk about, as you describe it, like the armadillo walking, I guess not one armadillo, but chain migration of armadillos across the isthmus of Central America, I guess going up to North America from the. You described it. It was like, I'm
Yes,
thinking about these
that
little
was
armadillo families, and it's like, oh, our family made it all the way to Costa Rica, and then the next 8 generations of armadillos make it to El Salvador. The next, but that animals moved like that. That these continents were separated, and the sea level went down, and the isthmus arose, and then things started walking across. I was like, oh right, and people too. Duh. But if you don't think about people as moving, which most of us don't, you think of as so station. You don't have this. It's such a brighter, flexible, more resilient, less competitive worldview because nobody's owning land; they're just moving through it, and that's why I was trying to say in the sort of the opening monologue that your relationship with the stranger is so different if you're not defending a piece of territory.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
another traveler on the road, which is why
mhm.
so much of the sort of the ethical code that they tried to write, that the Israelites tried to write as they became a sedentary people was, look, welcome strangers. You're going to get fertility from all these women from other cultures. Let them come. Don't, don't. But we never learned, of course. And I thought, and we're about the same age, even though you look 20 years younger than me, but we're about the same about the same age. And you were writing about sort of the late 80s, and I remember the those moments in the late 80s when the Berlin Wall fell and Mandela got released from prison and the European Union looked like it was going to be a cool thing and the Czech Republic had their revolution, and it seemed like something new was happening, and that there was going to be a new kind of less national movement of people. But then it turned on itself somehow. I'm wondering if you can explain why was there this negative reaction to such a melting of false boundaries?
I mean, I don't think I could have. I don't think there is one answer, and I'm certainly not equipped to answer fully that question. But you're right. There was that sense of walls are coming down, and now it's just the opposite, where we have more borders are fortified with walls and fences than at any time in the past. That's happening right now. Um, when I look at the most recent history of sort of the rise of right wing populists and this whole movement against people on the move that's happening right now, I see a couple of things combining. One is that migration patterns are changing, and that's because of the climate crisis. People are going to have to move into new places, and that's already happening. And so I think as people in the West start to realize that, that has rung some alarm bells of, oh, okay, brown people are going to come up into these white places, and that could be a problem for us, right? And then you also had this highly, just this spectacle of after the Syrian civil war, unleashed all these people coming into Europe. And of course, this was a minor flow of migration in the broad scheme of things, right? Like many, many more people are moving between countries in Africa, for example, or between countries in Asia. More of them are moving into places like Jordan than trying to get to Germany. So this is just like a spectacle, a myopic kind of spectacle of one tiny flow. All this migration has been going on behind the scenes that nobody's really noticing. It's not capturing
Right.
headlines. And then you suddenly have this extremely picturesque and dramatic uh, kind of it's a bottleneck in the Mediterranean Sea. And the Mediterranean Sea, this is a place where a million reporters they're happy to go there and report on what's going on in the Mediterranean, right? So you just have this huge spectacle. And I think that combined with this awareness of like migration patterns are changing, and this seemed like exactly the embodiment of that. The whole national security apparatus had been warning that climate change is going to unleash this tsunami of migrants over the wealthy parts of the world. And it was very, very lightly veiled racial kind of rhetoric around that, of like, okay, all these poor brown people are going to swamp us. And that's tapping into some really old ideological, sort of reflexive ideological stances. So I think when that happened, it just provided a great opportunity for a lot of right-wing populists to come into power and say, hey, look, this is what I told you, this is what's going to happen. We're going to get swamped by brown people. Put me in office and I'll pull up the ladders. And that's what we've seen.
Right. And it's not even all uh, uh, meant. A lot of it's cynical. Like, you point out how they change the statistics of migrant attacks by if they can even call them that, immigrant violence. So if it used to be that an attack was an attack, but now if a group threw like 10 rocks, it counts as 10 attacks because each rock counts as a separate attack.
Oh no, it
I
was
mean
even
that.
more than that. This is what the Border Patrol did and they trumpeted these. So Donald Trump comes into office, and his most coherent position, if he has anything, is xenophobia, racist xenophobia. Right? That's like, I mean, he's all over the place, but that's the one thing he says he's really going to do, and that he seems to actually kind of do, right? Actually implement. Um,
Yeah.
and so he has to justify that. Like, that's how he gets into power, because it's very easy to drum up xenophobic sentiment. It is right at the surface. You just have to scratch a little and poof, and this all comes out. So it's very, very easy, if you have no ethics and give a shit about violence, then yeah, sure, you can scratch that itch, right? So he gets into power doing that, and then of course he has to justify it somehow. So he has the Border Patrol, or through his minions, the Border Patrol starts to produce these reports saying, oh, these border crossers coming over from Mexico, they're very violent, and Border Patrol agents are dying and they're getting attacked, and attacks have gone up at this, like, this steep, these graphs with this steep incline. And it was all, and then later investigative journalists are like looking at these numbers, and they're kind of doing the math and figuring out that it used to be 5 people through 3 sticks at 2 Border Patrol agents, and that was one incident. And instead, they changed the math so that each stick thrown by each person at each Border Patrol agent was one thing. So from that one incident, you get like 20, 20 assaults, and it inflates their numbers. And this was happening across the board in right wing, in places led by right wing populists. They were bringing, these inflated, absolutely concocted numbers to try to justify why they had gotten into power. That act as if these asylum seekers and migrants were actually some huge problem, which they a really weren't, and b also the numbers were totally absorbable in most places. Of course, there's some places where, yeah, maybe it wasn't, maybe there's certain places that couldn't absorb as many new migrants as they got. That's possible. But in general, these are huge societies that many of them had labor shortages and housing openings, so there's plenty of places for these people to go. If we just had actually absorbed them and welcomed them, it probably would have happened and nobody really would have noticed. Because this is the other thing, Douglas, is integration and assimilation works. That's why we've been able to migrate all this time, right? Is because it works. You can live in the plains of South Asia and walk up to the Tibetan plateau where there's not enough oxygen, and you can learn to live there. You know, you
Hmm.
can take someone from the Brazilian rainforest and put them in Northern Europe, and they can learn to live there because we're fungible. That's the whole point.
Right, and our bodies are. I mean, there's what you mean too. That biologically we are. I go to Denver, and after a week, I'm making more red blood cells. My body figured out how to adapt to that because it was. I mean, meant to is a little biblical, but you know what I mean. It's resilient and flexible, and no, it's not like, oh, you're one of these, so you're supposed to live. You're supposed to live over there. It's like, send me to Tahiti. I'll figure it out.
I'll
Pretty
figure it out.
fast.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that
But
goes
the
back
the
to sort of no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
no, I was going to say the things that the resistance to migrants, the resistance to immigration. You later in the book, you kind of and they've really stayed with me because you broke it down into sort of three main reasons why we resist. That we blame them for violence, we fear insurrection, and we blame them for diseases. And I was looking back, and I looked all the way back, to because I'm into Torah this week. With Torah, with the Egyptians. Violence. Well, the first thing they did was they blamed Joseph for raping Pharaoh's wife. Oh, they're violent. Look at them. They stick him in jail. Insurrection. Pharaoh said it directly. They will turn on me. They're going to multiply. There's going to be too many. They're not going to agree with me, and they're going to have a revolution. And disease is the lepers and the insects and the fear of disease. And it's come right through to today. Violence. Oh, M13, whatever they are, MS-13. They're gonna, rape your wives. I'm gonna save your suburbs from these, Mexicans that are gonna come in. Insurrection. Yeah, they're gonna steal the vote. They're gonna go and vote Democratic. All the illegals are gonna line up. We need to go there with guns and stop them from doing that. And then disease, of course, the China virus, and everyone's going to come in from South America with COVID, where they actually have secretly high rates, unlike us. And so it's from as far back as you can go into the current day. It's these same three features, and what you've done, which is so important, is you've dispelled each one of these. You've dispelled them culturally, historically, and then even biologically and genetically. It's just not even scientifically true. But we keep coming back to them. And I keep wondering, do we keep coming back to them? Is there some thing that we have to look at? Is there some part of human nature, or is it just the way we're being programmed by the rulers and dictators?
I mean, I think it's both because on one hand, you're right. It's very easy to aggravate xenophobia, and like you said, all these old the whole we have these old ways of thinking about outsiders that are negative, and it'll come back in an instant once somebody starts talking that way. It's like it's like reflexive. But at the same time, there is so much migration going on all around us all the time, which is beneath the surface and which works, which we accept completely. It is the blood in our veins that we don't even notice. So all the millions of people who are moving around the world today and who are not in the headlines, who are not the unfortunate few who get scrutinized, but are actually allowed to just move and melt into other societies that they move into, that's happening everywhere. That's happening all everywhere. I mean, except for a few closed societies. That's happening all over the world, and that's been happening for centuries. So we have a huge capacity to accept new people because we don't even notice. We don't even notice some of them. They just come in and they just become part of a new society. I mean, look at
Right.
look at Donald Trump himself is the son of an immigrant, right? Like his mom came over as a domestic worker from Scotland. She had no money. She worked as a maid in New York. Like that's and then his her son is president. We don't even think of him as an immigrant, right? We don't even think of he has shed that like a snakeskin. It's just gone. He's American. So that just speaks to how easy it is for us to forget all the migration that's going on. And that migration actually does work almost all the time. So really the exception I think is the situation that we're talking about now, where you have a potent xenophobic sentiment that's rationalized through these arguments that, you scratch the surface and it's like, okay, that none of those things actually hold up.
Right. Or even that we have to use the language of, oh, look, our society is capable of absorbing this many immigrants. It's not like, oh, I'm going to absorb them because it's a stress. It's like, no, we're capable of being enriched and and changed and expanded and multiplied by the influx of fresh new blood and ideas. That's the lesson they keep trying to give you in the Bible, when they're losing fertility, they can't make any more babies, and then like Ruth shows up, or Leah, or somebody comes in, some foreign person, or the Midianites come. And it's like each time there's always somebody who says, "Uh-oh, those are brown people," or "they're different." But then the woman always saves the whole friggin' civilization from itself. So it's always migration that seems to save the day. And what and I know we're nearing the end of our time. I'm really interested in the future of migration, and how global warming will both instigate more migration, but perhaps be alleviated by migration. That people are looking at, okay, there's going to be climate change, that's going to lead to mass migration, and then that's going to create civilizational collapse. But I'm thinking it might be the opposite. Like, climate change is coming, it's going to catalyze more migration, and the migration might actually help us kind of rebalance civilization in a certain way.
I mean, I think if you this is why I wanted to bring in the biological aspect of migration,
Mm,
because we don't do a lot of things over and over and over again that are bad for us on a population level. Those kinds of behaviors tend to die out. And yet we migrated again and again and again and again, and not just us, but all these other wild species too. And the reason for that, in sort of a broad sense, is because the benefits have outweighed the costs. The This is not to say that there aren't costs. There are costs up front, especially in the beginning, but the long-term benefits are so huge. You have the resilience that's introduced, the introduction of diversity and innovation, all of those things, and genetic diversity, cultural diversity, intellectual diversity, all of those things. It's this process of moving into new place, adapting to it, developing novel ways of living, and then bringing that diversity into other places. So it's this constant sort of it's this fabric, it's a dynamic that continues, and that's what gives us the resilience. So as we enter this climate crisis, people are going to have to move, because we are scrambling the habitability of the planet. There's a lot of places where people aren't going to be able to live adequately anymore. So we can look at that as a crisis that we can try to stop. We can build walls and close the borders and trap people in those places. Or we can say, well, okay, the climate change is a crisis for sure, but the migration that it triggers could be part of the solution, not the crisis. What if we embraced that? And if we did, it wouldn't be to say, oh, it's all good, it's all great, and there's going to be no problems. It's to say, this is something that has long-term benefits for us. Let's try to manage it as a human reality, you know? And if we do that, we can minimize the costs and maximize the benefits, just like we do with every other part of human experience that has costs and benefits. You know, having children, getting sick, like these are all things that have costs and benefits, but we manage them because it's part of the human condition. It's part of our experience. It's how we survive. And I think migration needs to be brought back into that fold, that it is, we have to reclaim it as really central to how we're going to survive the climate crisis.
right. It's only unnatural when it's got the backdrop of unnatural nation state boundaries around it. When we look back to the butterflies at the beginning of your book that are slowly migrating up the hill, to a better spot for themselves, and proving that animals migrate because of climate, but migrate successfully. It's like, oh, this is just how things happen. This field dried up, so we walked over there, and then the salmon were over here, so we go there every April. Then we go down here because the guavas are coming off the trees. It's like, this is not rocket science. It's just a basic movement of ja people, as it were. Uh, the thing I wanted to close on, which was so Team Human-esque for me, was the research that you, I mean, I would say uncovered. I'm sure it's there for anyone to see, but none of us read anymore. The DNA mitochondria stuff was all new to me. The idea that when they analyze the DNA and mitochondria, it turns out that people separated into all these different kinds of people much more recently than we thought. I mean, I would think, oh, right, these ones came out of Africa like a million years ago or something, but not at all.
No, it's
So
measured
that
in
the
the
people
more
that we
like,
thought of as other are actually just us.
yeah, so you don't even have to go back that many generations of people who are alive today. We only have to go back like not that many generations to the point where we all have a common ancestor. It's not that long ago, that maybe 1,000 generations ago we all had a common ancestor. So in this really
Or 1,000 years
kind of
even.
profound way, we are
Yeah.
we are one big family. Of course we are, right? Like
You
that's
mean
what
a
a
thousand
species is.
generations?
That's who
You
we
mean
are.
1,000 generations or like 1,000 years?
No, like I think it's like 1,000 or around a thousand
Because you said in the
generations,
book it
something
was
like
like
that, where you can
2,000
find a
years
common
ago.
ancestor. Mhm.
Yeah.
Not a
Yeah,
thousand
which is
years
not
ago.
that right. It's not that long
Yeah.
ago though. And
No, it's
that
not
the
that long
journey
ago.
out
I
of
mean,
Africa, yeah, was a
yeah,
pretty
it's not that long
recent
ago.
thing. It's not like we were monkeys or something. We were, you know,
We were people.
we were
Yeah,
people with
and
urns and stuff.
the other amazing thing about it is that, when we walked out of Africa, there's this idea that we walked out of Africa and, the planet was unpopulated. And so we just populated all the continents, and then we just stayed still for millennia until, we got like steamships and stuff like that and started moving around fast again. Well, actually, we know from paleogenetics now that, in fact, when we walked out of Africa, there was people everywhere already, all these other human species that are now extinct, and we assimilated with them. That's why we have their genes in our DNA. And then we didn't stay still. We kept moving. So people moved out of North America, settled there, met some other people who were there, mixed with them, went back to Asia, went back to Africa, went back to, in and out, these complicated migratory routes in the past when it wasn't even easy, and they're just as complicated as our migratory routes are today. So that, I think that
Right.
really tells you something about what migration means for our species.
Right. And it also reminds us all, and we kind of have to close here because they're going to move on with the festival. But it also reminds us of just how close we are to each other. The theme of Team Human has always been find the others, as it find the others and then connect with them. And what you're sort of showing me is that there really are no others. There's just lots and lots of us. And once you start to see it that way, gosh, it becomes a whole lot more fun and less threatening to welcome other people into our uh, worlds.
Absolutely. That was perfectly put. Yes.
Well, thank you, Sonia Shah. Everyone, get the next great migration. It's a super important book, and which I didn't say either. This is one of the first nonfiction books I've read in really maybe 10 years that reads like literature. I mean, it's not flowery, but um, it's so poetically and gently expressed. It's just a word for word delight to go through this. So even if you don't care about the subject, just read it for the language. It's a beautiful experience.
Thank you, Douglas.
It's
That
a
was
it's a
really nice.
walk. Oh, thanks. It's a journey. It really is. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Arjan and Impact. Thank you for having us, and you can retake your stage. Unless we've been doing this just with each other in the abyss,
No
which
one's
is
watching.
completely possible. Go see if they come back. He's there.
Yes. Hi,
Okay.
hi, Douglas.
Hey
Hi,
there.
Sonia. It was great to listen to you and to your very engaging conversation. Thanks for allowing us to be a part of that. But now, yeah, you're right. We have to move on with the program, and that's Jasper Gieping's performance that we're preparing for. That will take us a bit, but meanwhile, you can tune into Impact TV. Thanks, Sonia. Thanks, Douglas. And it was very nice having you.